He walked with the quiet confidence of a man who had earned every step of success. The polished leather of his shoes tapped against the jet bridge floor, his ticket in one hand, his carry-on in the other. For him, flying first class was not about luxury, it was about efficiency, comfort, and the dignity of rest after endless days of high-stakes meetings. But tonight, as he reached the threshold of the aircraft, that confidence met its first challenger. "Sir," a voice cut sharply through the air. A flight attendant, crisp in uniform and colder in tone, extended an arm like a barrier. "First class is at the front of the plane. Economy is that way." The CEO paused. Collected, he held up his boarding pass, his name clearly printed in bold letters. "Yes," he replied evenly. "Seat 1A." The attendant's eyes narrowed. For a long second, she didn't even glance at the ticket. Her gaze traveled over him, instead his skin, his frame, his tailored suit. A look that said, "You don't belong here." Passengers behind him began to shuffle, impatient. A couple exchanged knowing smirks, as if enjoying the spectacle. Whispers stirred like wind through dry leaves. "Are you sure this is correct?" The attendant pressed, her tone dripping with doubt. The CEO did not flinch. "I'm certain," he said softly, voice steady but firm. She finally snatched the ticket, scanning it with deliberate slowness, as if hoping the paper itself would reveal a mistake. Her lips pursed when the truth was undeniable. "First class, seat 1A. Yet instead of moving aside, she stepped closer, lowering her voice but not her suspicion. "Sir, perhaps you should wait until I confirm this with the captain. Sometimes errors are made." A murmur rippled through the boarding line. A man in a sports jacket chuckled under his breath, loud enough to be heard. A woman shook her head as if to say, "This is ridiculous." But not surprising. In that moment, humiliation pressed heavy on the CEO's chest. Not because he doubted his worth, but because once again, in front of strangers, his identity was being challenged, questioned, diminished. He could have raised his voice. He could have demanded recognition. Instead, he stood tall, letting silence speak louder than any protest. Behind him, a young boy whispered to his mother, "Why won't they let him sit down?" The mother hushed him quickly, but the question lingered in the air like smoke. The CEO's grip tightened on his carry-on handle. His eyes flickered not with rage, but with patience sharpened by years of trials just like this. He had climbed higher than anyone ever expected. Yet here, in a narrow airplane doorway, the old weight of judgment returned. Heavy and familiar. The attendant, still blocking the way, forced a brittle smile. "Please, step aside. I'll sort this out in just a moment." "Step aside. Wait, prove yourself again." The line of passengers stretched further, their irritation mounting. A man behind muttered, "Come on already," and someone else sighed in annoyance. But no one spoke up for him. Not one. The CEO inhaled slowly, eyes calm, jaw set. He knew a storm was building, not just within him but within the entire cabin. This wasn't about a seat anymore. It was about respect, dignity, and the silent war between perception and truth. And though he said nothing, though he allowed her to stall him in front of dozens of watching eyes, one thing became clear. This battle, small as it looked, was far from over. Because in 12 minutes, the balance of power would shift, and the very plane she tried to keep him off would not move without his word. To be continued in Chapter 2. Silent. Fury in the aisle. The narrow aisle of the plane had never felt so wide, so exposed. The CEO stood motionless, his ticket still clutched in his hand, while the flight attendant's voice continued to slice through the air like glass. "Sir, I really think you've made a mistake," she insisted, her tone polished on the surface but carrying that unmistakable edge. "This section is reserved for first-class passengers only." He didn't answer right away. His chest rose and fell slowly, as if each breath carried the weight of every silent battle he had fought before this one. Around him, the audience grew. A couple of rows filled with passengers leaned forward, eager to catch every word. Some frowned in discomfort, while others wore faint smirks, as though the scene was free entertainment before takeoff. A man in a business suit muttered under his breath, "Should have just gone straight to the back." His companion chuckled, not softly enough to be missed. The CEO's eyes shifted, taking in the faces around him. Not one stranger spoke up. Not one voice defended his right to the seat he had paid for. He stood alone, yet he stood tall. That attendant pressed again. "Maybe you misread your ticket. Let me double-check with my supervisor." His hand rose gently, stopping her words. "There's no need," he said. His voice was calm. Calm. "I know what I paid for. I know where I belong." But beneath that calmness burned a silent fury. It showed not in his words, but in the tension of his jaw, the steady grip on his luggage, the steel in his eyes. Whispers fluttered from row to row. A mother hushed her curious child. A teenager snuck out his phone, angling it discreetly as if this moment were worth recording. The CEO said nothing more. He simply held the attendant's gaze, unblinking, unyielding, and in that silence, something shifted. The air grew heavier. The passengers, once amused, now sensed the storm beneath his stillness. They didn't know his name. They didn't know his power, but they could feel the gravity of a man who was choosing patience over explosion. The attendant, unsettled, tried to regain her authority. "Sir, if you'll just wait a few moments," but he didn't move. Not an inch. He stood planted in the aisle, a wall of composure she could not push past. Minutes stretched like hours. The line of boarding passengers slowed to a crawl, irritation growing. Yet he remained, silent and unshaken. Inside, though, his thoughts raced. He remembered other doors he had been denied, other rooms where he was told he didn't belong. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't a young man clawing for a chance. He was the man in charge of empires. The man whose signature could change the fate of companies, and soon. Everyone on this plane would know it. For now, he chose restraint. For now, he allowed the doubt to linger, the whispers to grow, the mockery to echo. Because in holding back, he was building something far more powerful than an outburst. He was building suspense, and when he finally moved, when he finally spoke again, the entire plane would feel the shift. The silence wasn't weakness. It was the calm before the storm. And the storm was coming. To be continued in Chapter 3, The Weight of a Lifetime. To understand the silence burning inside him in that narrow aisle, you have to step back far back to where his story began. Because this moment, this fight for a seat, was not new. It was simply the latest chapter in a life filled with locked doors and pointed fingers. He was born in a neighborhood where dreams rarely survived past childhood. Cracked sidewalks, flickering streetlights, in a small one-bedroom home where his mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. He remembered nights when the fridge held little more than milk and bread, and mornings when he walked to school in shoes with soles worn thin. Even then, he carried himself with quiet pride. His teachers noticed. One would often tell him, "You've got a fire in you, boy. Don't let this world put it out." But the world tried. At 16, he applied for a part-time job at a local diner. He watched others' kids with less drive, less hunger, get picked ahead of him. The manager had smiled, almost apologetically. "We're not hiring right now." Yet days later, he saw someone new in uniform behind the counter. He understood the message. "You don't belong here." In college, it happened again. He worked harder than anyone top of his class. The first to arrive, the last to leave. But when internship opportunities came, his name was mysteriously missing from the lists. Professors praised his brilliance in private, but in the halls of power, doors closed without explanation. Still, he pushed forward. Late nights studying under the dim light of library lamps, early mornings delivering newspapers to cover tuition. Every rejection became fuel. Every doubt sharpened his resolve. One memory cut deeper than most. Standing outside a corporate building, resume in hand, wearing his only suit. The receptionist looked him over once and said, "Interviews are full today." He knew it wasn't true. He had confirmed his appointment twice. Yet he turned and walked away, jaw clenched, promising himself he would return one day, not as an applicant, but as an owner. Years passed, and he did exactly that. Through grit, sacrifice, and unshakable focus, he climbed. A small business became a thriving company. That company grew into an empire. His name began appearing in headlines, his face on magazine covers. His voice in boardrooms where billions were decided. And yet no matter how high he climbed, there were still moments, subtle and sharp, that reminded him of the old refrain, "You don't belong." A delayed reservation at a 5-star hotel, a suspicious glance in an upscale store, a conference where he was mistaken for the driver instead of the keynote speaker. Each time, he didn't explode. He absorbed it, filed it away, and let it strengthen the fire inside. Now, standing in the aisle of this plane, facing the cold gaze of a flight attendant who doubted his right to sit in the very seat he had purchased, he felt all those years pressed down on him at once. This wasn't just about a chair on an aircraft. It was about every barrier, every insult, every locked door he had broken through. His silence carried decades of rejection and resilience. His composure was carved from 1,000 battles nobody had seen. The passengers around him saw only a man being delayed. They couldn't feel the weight of history on his shoulders, but he could. And that weight, heavy as it was, did not bend him. It steadied him. It reminded him that he had always turned doubt into power, always turned rejection into fuel. So he stood there, calm as stone, waiting, because he knew the story was about to shift. The humiliation in this aisle would not be the ending. It would be the spark. The moment should have ended the second he held up his ticket. The seat number was there in black and white, 1A, first class, proof, undeniable. But instead of stepping aside, the attendant pressed her lips into a thin smile and said, "Please wait here while I let the other passengers board. We'll sort it out after." It was a dismissal, not a mistake, a dismissal. The line behind him moved again. Passengers filing past as if he were an obstacle, not a paying customer. Each body that brushed his shoulder carried with it a sting of humiliation. A man in a navy blazer glanced at the ticket in his hand, then at his face, before shaking his head with a smirk. He whispered something to his companion, who stifled a laugh. The sound echoed louder than it should have in that confined space. The CEO's jaw tightened. Still, he did not raise his voice. He had endured worse. But this was different. This wasn't private. It was public, a theater of ridicule. staged in front of strangers who chose silence over decency. The attendant leaned in, her voice low but sharp. "It'll just be a few minutes. Please, don't hold up the line, don't hold up the line." As though he were the problem. As though the inconvenience was his doing. A woman in the boarding group offered him a pitying look before sliding into her seat. A young man in headphones rolled his eyes dramatically, muttering, "Unbelievable." None of them directed their frustration at the right person. It all landed on him. For a heartbeat, he considered swallowing it, letting the scene play out. But then he caught his reflection in the small window by the door. He saw not only himself but the boy who once walked away from interviews denied. The young man passed over for promotions. The man questioned in lobbies and boardrooms, and something inside him said, "No more." His voice cut through the air. Calm but sharp enough to command silence. "I've shown you my ticket," he said. "I've paid for my seat. I will not be treated as if I don't belong here." The attendant stiffened, caught off guard by the firmness in his tone. "Sir, I'm just doing my job." "No," he interrupted, his voice steady, almost quiet. "You're not. Your job is to respect your passengers. Every one of them." The nearby murmurs faltered. Passengers leaned closer, sensing a shift in the air. The smirks disappeared. The silence stretched, heavy and uneasy. The attendant faltered, her authority suddenly less certain. She gestured awkwardly toward the galley. "I'll check with the captain," but it was too late. The damage had been done. The smirks, the whispers, the public doubt, it had all piled together into one undeniable truth. Dignity demanded a response, and for the first time that evening, the CEO allowed his fury not in shouting, not in rage, but in action to take shape. Because in that instant, a decision crystallized. He would not just reclaim his seat, he would reclaim the narrative. And in just a few short minutes, everyone on this plane, from the attendant to the pilot, would discover exactly who they had tried to dismiss. The aisle had gone quiet, thick with tension. Passengers shuffled uneasily in their seats, glancing between the attendant and the man she had tried to humiliate. No one dared to speak, but everyone leaned in, waiting to see what would happen next. And then he moved. Slowly, deliberately, the CEO reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. There was no rush in his motion, no anger in his expression, just calm precision. The kind of calm that unsettles people more than rage ever could. The attendant frowned, unsure. "Sir, I'll be back shortly." There's no need for, but he was already dialing. One ring. Two. The sound carried faintly in the hush of the cabin. A few passengers craned their necks to peek, curiosity sparking whispers. Who was he calling? A friend? A lawyer? Security? The CEO's face revealed nothing. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low but commanding, filling the cabin like the steady beat of a drum. "Put me through 2 operations." The attendant froze. Operations. The word alone felt dangerous. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances. A man in the third row muttered, "Operations." As in airline operations, his wife shushed him, eyes wide. On the line, a voice responded quickly, respectful. "Yes, sir, right away." That respect, that sudden shift in tone, it sent ripples through the aisle. Whoever he was, he clearly wasn't just another passenger. The CEO's gaze never left the attendant as he continued, calm, measured, unshakable. "I'm on flight 227. We have a situation. Delay the departure. Ground the aircraft until I say otherwise." For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. The words hung in the air like thunder waiting to break. The attendant blinked, her confidence faltering. "Excuse me, sir, did you just ground the aircraft?" He ended the call without answering, sliding the phone back into his pocket. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Round him, passengers stirred in confusion. Some whispered nervously, others stared, realization dawning in their eyes. This wasn't a man bluffing. This was someone with authority, real authority. The attendant's face flushed, a bead of sweat forming just beneath her hairline. She tried to mask her unease with a brittle smile. I'll go check with the captain." She turned quickly, almost stumbling, as she hurried toward the cockpit. The CEO stood still, perfectly composed, as though nothing unusual had happened. But the cabin was alive with speculation now. "Who is this guy?" One passenger whispered, "He just grounded the plane." Another murmured, disbelief thick in his tone. For the first time since boarding, the balance of power had shifted. The whispers of mockery had transformed into whispers of awe and fear, and the CEO, he didn't need to explain himself. Not yet. His silence was enough, because the next move, the one that would shake the crew and the passengers alike, was still coming, and when it arrived, there would be no doubt left about who truly controlled this flight. The plane should have been rolling toward the runway by now. Instead, it sat frozen at the gate, engines humming low, like a restless beast chained in place. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering, trying to piece together what was happening. The announcement came without warning. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice crackled through the intercom. "Unusually strained, our departure has been delayed. Please remain seated. Further updates will follow." No reason, no explanation, just DELAYEDA. Ripple of unease passed through the cabin. Parents comforted restless children. Business travelers checked their watches, irritated, but underneath the normal grumbling, something different stirred a sense that this delay wasn't routine, because everyone remembered the man in the aisle, the one who had made that single, commanding phone call. Eyes darted toward him again. He sat still, calm, unbothered, as if he had known this moment would arrive. A woman in the row ahead leaned toward her husband, voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think he caused this?" Her husband's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but whoever he is, the crew looks rattled," and rattled they were. The flight attendant who had denied him earlier stood stiffly at the front, clutching her clipboard. The confidence she had wielded so easily before was gone. Her smile trembled, her hands fidgeted. Every so often, she glanced back at him, then quickly away, like a child afraid of being caught staring. Her colleague nudged her gently. "What did you do?" She swallowed hard. I don't know. I just thought he was." She cut herself off, shaking her head. "I didn't know he had connections." Connections. The word didn't even come close. Passengers noticed her unease, and with every nervous glance she cast toward the CEO, the rumors grew louder. Is he with the airline? Maybe government? No? Bigger. Look at the way they're acting around him. The hum of whispers swelled until it filled the cabin like a second engine. Tension wrapped itself around every row, squeezing tighter with each passing minute. Finally, the cockpit door opened. A junior officer stepped out, his face pale, his voice hushed as he leaned toward the attendant. Ground control said, "We're not cleared." Orders came from above, way above. Her blood ran cold. She looked past him, toward the man still seated in economy, his expression unreadable. The weight of realization pressed down on her chest. This wasn't just a passenger. This wasn't a man she could brush aside with a fake smile and dismissive tone. This was someone who could stop a plane with a single call. And suddenly, her earlier arrogance felt like a noose tightening around her neck. The murmurs among passengers grew bolder now. Some pulled out phones, recording, convinced they were witnessing something extraordinary. Others sat rigid, unwilling to move, as though any sound might shatter the fragile air. The CEO shifted slightly, folding his hands, his calm presence somehow more intimidating than anger could ever be. He didn't need to say a word. Everyone could feel it. Control of this flight was no longer in the cockpit. It rested with him. The cabin waited, breath held, hearts pounding. The silence was deafening, the suspense unbearable. Something was coming, and when it did, it wouldn't just be the flight attendant who realized how deeply she had miscalculated, because the next revelation would shake the entire plane. The cockpit door slammed open with a metallic thud. Out stepped a pilot, broad-shouldered, cap tilted low, jaw clenched in barely contained frustration. His polished shoes struck the floor in heavy, deliberate steps as he marched down the narrow aisle. The entire cabin froze, every eye glued to him, breaths caught in collective suspense. "Who?" the pilot growled, scanning the rows, "thinks they have the power to hold my plane on the ground?" Silence. Not even the babies cried. The passengers shifted uncomfortably, trying to look anywhere but at the man everyone knew he was walking toward. The pilot's gaze landed on him, the calm figure, seated halfway down the aisle. A man who had not raised his voice, not argued, not pleaded. A man who had simply made one call, the CEO. The pilot stopped directly in front of him, crossing his arms. His voice dropped, sharp as a blade. "Sir, whatever grievance you think you have, you're delaying over 200 people. You don't have that kind of authority." The words lingered in the air, heavy, final, until the CEO finally raised his eyes. His calm, measured stare cut through the tension like lightning through storm clouds. "I don't," he said softly. A slow smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, not amusement, but something colder, controlled power. Then he rose from his seat, not in anger, not in haste. Every movement was deliberate, steady, commanding. The cabin seemed to shrink around him as he stood. "You should know," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the stunned passengers. "Before you lecture me about authority, exactly who you're speaking to." The pilot's jaw tightened. "And who might that be?" The CEO leaned in slightly, not whispering, but speaking with the precision of a man used to boardrooms, where billions shifted hands at his word. "I'm not just a passenger. I'm not just a ticket holder. I am the single largest private investor in this airline. When I say the bird doesn't fly, it doesn't fly." Gasps exploded across the cabin. The words rippled through rows like wildfire. "What? He owns the airline? Investor? Did he just say largest?" Phones shot up, passengers scrambling to capture the moment. The once dismissive smirks, the stifled laughter from earlier, replaced with wide eyes, slack jaws, and the realization that they were in the presence of someone whose signature could make or break fortunes. The flight attendant who had sneered at him earlier visibly paled. Her clipboard slipped from trembling hands, clattering to the floor. The pilot staggered back half a step, caught off guard, then steadied himself. "If that's true," the CEO cut him off with a calm raise of his hand. "It is true. And while you were prepared to leave me standing in that aisle, mocking me, denying me dignity, the board of directors will hear how their pilots and crew treat the man who signs their paychecks." The cabin buzzed with nervous energy. Like static before a lightning strike, the pilot swallowed hard, anger giving way to unease. His authority, once absolute, had been shattered in seconds. Around him, his crew watched silently, their loyalty shifting in real time toward the man whose name now carried undeniable weight. The CEO stepped closer, lowering his voice, but the entire cabin leaned in, desperate to catch every word. Here's what's going to happen. This plane will not move until the disrespect is addressed. You can choose to correct it, or I'll choose someone else to fly this bird who understands the meaning of accountability. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact, spoken with the ease of a man who had issued commands all his life, and seen the world bend to them. The pilot stood frozen, the weight of 200 passengers' eyes pressing on him, the authority he once wielded dissolving under the shadow of the man before him. And in that moment, every person on board understood. The balance of power had shifted. The bird was grounded not by weather, not by mechanics, but by one man's quiet, unstoppable will. The question now was simple. What would the pilot do? The intercom crackled to life, breaking the tense silence. "This is your captain speaking. We've been instructed to remain grounded until further notice." The words landed like a thunderclap. Murmurs surged through the cabin, a storm of confusion and speculation. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering to one another, trying to piece together what had just happened. The confident rhythm of air travel, the expectation of departure, the hum of routine had been shattered. And at the center of it all, the CEO sat perfectly still. His silence was no longer mistaken for weakness. It was authority wrapped in composure. A man who had seen storms far greater than this and walked through them untouched. The pilot, beads of sweat forming at his temple, disappeared with him into the narrow confines of the galley. The door closed behind them, shutting out the eyes and ears of the passengers, but the cabin leaned forward anyway, straining to catch a glimpse, desperate to know what was unfolding just beyond reach. Inside, the atmosphere was taut, suffocating. The CEO's voice was low, precise. "You had a choice," he said, his words slicing through the tension. "You could have corrected your crew when you saw injustice unfolding. Instead, you stood by." The flight attendant who had first blocked his way trembled beside the captain, her earlier arrogance replaced with raw fear. Her eyes darted to the floor, then to the man she had dismissed not 15 minutes ago. I didn't mean," she stammered. The CEO cut her off with a raised hand, calm, controlled, unforgiving. "Intentions don't erase actions. Respect isn't optional in this company. It's the standard." The pilot clenched his jaw, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Sir, with all due respect." "Respect." The CEO's eyes narrowed. "You let your crew humiliate a paying customer, a first-class ticket holder. You let it escalate until I had to intervene. That is not leadership. That is failure." The words were delivered like a verdict, and then came the sentence. "Effective immediately," he said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "You are relieved of duty, both of you. This flight will not leave the ground under your command." The attendant gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The pilot's face drained of color, rage and disbelief warring behind his eyes. But there was nothing left to argue. The decision was final. Outside the galley, the cabin stirred as word began to spread. A stewardess whispered to a passenger in the first row, and the whisper leaped like fire through dry grass. "The pilot's been fired. They're replacing the crew. My God, is this real?" Phones lit up again. Passengers recording, narrating, unable to believe they were witnessing corporate justice unfold in real time. The CEO emerged moments later, his stride unhurried, his presence filling the aisle like gravity itself. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. He simply carried himself with the quiet certainty of a man who had demanded respect his entire life, and now ensured it not only for himself, but for everyone who would come after. As he returned to his seat, the weight of his decision settled over the cabin. Passengers who had once doubted him now straightened in their chairs, their eyes following him with something close to awe. The bird was still grounded, but in that silence, something far more powerful had taken flight. Accountability. And the question hanging in the air was clear. If this was how he handled a single act of disrespect, what would his next move be when the world outside learned what had just happened here? For a long moment, the cabin was frozen in stunned silence. The pilot was gone, the attendant was gone, and the man who had been mocked, doubted, and delayed was still standing tall. Then, slowly, like the first clap of thunder breaking a storm, a sound rose from the back of the plane. Clap. It was hesitant at first, a single pair of hands striking together, but then another joined, and another, until the sound swelled into applause that rolled through the cabin like a wave. Passengers who had stared in judgment minutes ago were now on their feet, their voices lifted in approval. A woman leaned across the aisle, her eyes shimmering. "Sir, I'm sorry, I should have spoken up sooner." The CEO met her gaze, calm and steady. "Apologies aren't owed to me," he said quietly. "They're owed to the next person who might not have the chance to speak for themselves." The words carried, drifting over the clapping, and more passengers nodded in solemn agreement. Some bowed their heads. Others shifted uncomfortably, realizing their silence had been complicity. And yet, amid the applause, the CEO didn't raise his chin in triumph. He didn't smile or gloat. He simply turned, walked back to his first-class seat, and placed his carry-on neatly in the overhead bin. Every step was measured, dignified. Every movement spoke louder than any victory. Speech could. As he settled into the leather seat that had always been his, the cabin's energy shifted once more. Respect filled the air, real respect, not the shallow kind given to titles or wealth, but the kind born from witnessing integrity in action. A passenger near the front whispered to his wife, "That man, he didn't just win, he changed the whole plane." The applause lingered, echoing against the walls of the fuselage, before it finally softened into quiet reverence. Phones were lowered, murmurs ceased, and for the first time since boarding, the cabin was still. The CEO rested his hands on the armrests, his face calm, his posture unshaken. He didn't bask in the vindication, because for him, this was never about victory. It was about principle, about dignity, about drawing a line so clear that no one could miss it. And as the engines idled outside, the passengers who had watched humiliation turn to justice understood one thing with crystal clarity. They had just witnessed a moment far bigger than a denied seat. It was the quiet rewriting of respect, carried out in real time. And yet, as powerful as this moment was, the story was not finished. Because the world beyond this cabin was about to find out what had happened here, and the impact would ripple far beyond the walls of a grounded plane. The engines roared back to life, vibrations humming through the cabin like a heartbeat. After the storm of humiliation, confrontation, and justice, the plane was finally preparing for departure. But no one on board would ever think of this flight as ordinary again. Passengers sat quietly now, their voices hushed, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the man in seat 2A. The CEO didn't acknowledge the stares. He simply gazed out the window, watching the runway lights flicker against the night. Calm, steady, full, because for him, this was never about proving wealth or flexing power. It was about something far deeper. Dignity. A voiceover thoughts seemed to echo with him. Respect is not given when convenient. It must be demanded when it's denied. Otherwise, silence becomes surrender. Those words, unspoken yet resonant, seemed to settle into the hearts of every passenger on board. Some carried shame for their silence. Others carried admiration for his strength. But all of them knew they had just witnessed something they would carry with them far beyond this flight. The aircraft lifted off, wheels leaving the earth, climbing into the sky. As altitude rose, so too did the lesson. Because power, the CEO knew, wasn't in money, or even in influence. True power was in the refusal to bow when dignity was stripped away. True power was calm in the face of insult, measured in the heat of injustice, decisive when it mattered most. And he hadn't just reminded the crew of that truth, he had shown every passenger, every phone, camera, recording, and soon the world beyond this plane. One man's stand had turned humiliation into applause, silence into accountability, injustice into justice delivered in real time, before hundreds of eyes that would never forget. The cabin lights dimmed, the applause had faded, yet an invisible energy remained, hanging in the air like oxygen itself. The CEO leaned back into his seat, exhaling a breath that was steady, controlled. He didn't look victorious. He didn't need to, because victory wasn't about breaking his opponent, it was about refusing to be broken himself. A man across the aisle leaned forward slightly, his voice low, respectful. "Sir, thank you." For all of us, the CEO turned, offered a small nod, and returned his gaze to the clouds beyond the glass. That was enough. The plane climbed higher, 10,000 feet, then 20,000 feet, until the world below shrank into shadows and silence. But inside that cabin, the lesson only grew larger. Power is not about titles. It's not about sitting in first class, or owning shares, or having the final word. Power is about standing tall when the world tries to shrink you. It's about grounding the lies of prejudice, and letting respect finally take flight. And on that night, somewhere above the clouds, a simple truth was written across every heart in that cabin. Dignity denied is dignity defended.